Heaven sent.
Throughout the broad and sometimes complicated history of gaming, there have been many tales of triumph and innovation within countless development studios all across the globe. From Valve Software and their impressive work in introducing the use of realistic physics in their games, to id Software, who are majorly responsible for grandfathering the entire first-person shooter genre. Examples such as these are responsible for some of our greatest memories as gamers, and even more so responsible for the evolution of gaming as a whole. From 8-bit visuals to realistically detailed landscapes and characters, we've come a long way when it comes to the look and feel of our games in present day. But looking back on the vast number of studios responsible for presenting some of my favorite titles, there's always been one certain studio that I've found to be severely overlooked. A studio that was once the backbone of Sony for many decades and responsible for some of the PlayStation's most incredible releases. A team comprised of passionate developers who weren't afraid to take chances, which in turn gave us some of the most unique titles the world of gaming has ever seen. In this video, we're here to talk about the rise and fall of one of Sony's most legendary studios, and to praise the many accomplished titles that had come at the hands of their hard work. A celebration of what once was, and a toast to the many great memories made in their beautifully crafted worlds. So without further ado, allow me to indulge you all into a brief history of how this studio came to be, and join along as we highlight some of their greatest releases, and recap on where things just may have went wrong. So grab yourself a nice beverage and get ready to tuck in, because it's time for us to step into the beautiful world of Japan Studios. Taking things back to the wonderful year of 1993, a star was born. Oh wait, I guess we're not here to talk about me, are we? Anywho, the day was November 16th, 1993, a day in which Japan Studios was officially formed. At this time, Sony was hard at work on releasing their upcoming console with the PlayStation 1, and was searching for talented developers that could assist them in creating some unique titles. Up until this point, Sony had no prior experience in creating anything related to gaming, and in order for them to stand out to an industry that was primarily dominated by Nintendo for almost a decade, they were going to need to come with something fresh and exciting. And so they got to work in picking up hungry developers, giving them a vision and just kind of letting them run wild with it. And it really showed in some of their earlier work. Which brings us to the very first game that Japan Studio had ever developed. And I promise, it's much weirder than it sounds. Have you ever wondered what it'd be like to journey through a spacecraft, armed to the teeth with donut-shooting laser guns on a team full of crossbred bounty hunters? Well, you're in luck, because Crime Crackers is the perfect solution for anybody looking to satiate those intergalactic cravings. Crime Crackers was the very first offering from the developers at Japan Studio. It was a title that was equally ambitious as it was just purely strange. The game begins 20 years after a large-scale war has been waged across the faraway galaxy, as we step into the shoes of 3 different bounty hunters, hired by police to crack down on crime. Our team has been placed on a spaceship called the Pink Dolphin, in which we are tasked with ridding the ship of its overwhelming amount of bad guys on board. The gameplay is similar to a dungeon crawler while combining the action of a first-person shooter, almost like Doom with some RPG elements. You'll set out on a slew of linear-style missions, solving puzzles, collecting items, and defeating bosses, and while you progress throughout the story, so do your characters in rank. Now the game's plot was pretty basic, but the unique mix of gameplay was definitely something of intrigue for gamers who enjoyed the likes of FPS or RPG games. And while the game was ambitious in its execution, it unfortunately didn't fare too well with critics. With mostly mixed reviews coming from many prolific sources of the time, it seemed that the biggest complaint was in how repetitive the game could be. While some found it to be well thought out or proof of Sony's new console being on par with its competitors, most just found the game to be kind of boring, and a little less impressive than they had hoped for. This may not have been a victory for Japan Studios in their very first release, but it was a very good indicator of the direction this studio would continue to take. At this time in gaming, things were kind of like the Wild West. The possibilities for creativity seem limitless, and with the technology of next-gen consoles much like the PS1 now looking to set the standard for gaming, Japan Studio found the sky to be the limit in what they could create next. They took what criticism they received on their first game and decided to educate themselves in what ways they could innovate for the future. And with that being said, just a little over 2 years later, their first big hit would finally come to fruition. The year was 1996. With the PlayStation being released just 2 years prior, there was still plenty of room for innovation in utilizing the power of Sony's debut console. Many different legendary titles came to be up to this point, shifting the focus of how games should be played and the potential of what's to come. But few could ever expect what was on the horizon. The concept of rhythm-based gaming was something that had yet to be executed at that time, and with an open-minded development team like Japan Studio joining alongside Nana Onsha, the intriguing idea of rhythm-based gaming was about to become a reality. Parappa the Rapper, released in Japan on December 6, 1996, took the world of gaming by storm with its charming characters and a strange yet captivating atmosphere. The game follows Parappa, a beanie-wearing dog with an insatiable love interest for a sunflower girl named Sunny. Parappa wants to win over the heart of this beloved Sunny and decides to dive into what every male who's seeking attention does: self-improvement. This brings Parappa to learning karate from an onion-headed sensei, getting his driver's license, learning to bake a cake, and performing a concert in front of all of his pals and classmates. The game is incredibly goofy and has a very 90s Nickelodeon kind of feel to it. Parappa plays like most rhythm-based games you're probably already keen to, but at the time of its release, this was next level stuff. You'll find yourself tapping along to the rhythm of music throughout each level, with each button press gauging to how well Parappa will flow with the beat. And although this may seem like a simple game to create, behind the scenes told a much more complex tale. The development process of Parappa was headed by Masaya Masora, a musician in a pretty successful Japanese band at the time. But with Masora not being too keen on the spotlight, he wanted to work with music in a more behind the scenes fashion, and decided to focus his attention to game design. The game began development before the release of the PlayStation, and eventually recruited Japan Studio, who aided in both developing the game and making it a PlayStation exclusive. Masora knew that he wanted to create something music-based, and took a liking to the idea of using actual voices for characters and basing the game around rap music. They recruited artist Roddy Greenblatt to design the characters of the game, starting with Parappa, who had initially taken the form of a shrimp. With some characters being changed over time, the game's lead character came to be as we know him today, the rhyme-spitting dog with an infatuation for botany and plenty of ambition to go around. All of the lyrics to each of the game's tracks were initially written in Japanese by Masaya himself, who later recruited Ryu Watabe, a Japanese rapper, to translate and freestyle the lyrics for the game's final release. The game was also one of the first of its kind to introduce motion capture for in-game characters, and gave the game an incredibly unique sense of style for its time. Because of this game being the first of its kind, promotion came to be somewhat of a challenge for the marketing team, as they weren't sure what kind of target demographic they should be aiming for. It was documented that most of the staff felt that Parappa was hardly a game at all, but more so like an interactive album. They eventually decided to primarily shift their focus on marketing to children, which came to be a demographic that struggled in finishing the game, they found out. Despite a few hiccups in the game's release and mounting confusion on how to do so, the game fared incredibly well and was actually the 7th best-selling game in Japan at that time. Upon its success in Japan, Sony decided it was time to take the likes of Parappa and his homies across the globe, and the game was officially released in North America on November 17, 1997. The Western release was very much on par with the success they had found earlier in Japan, with many critics boasting the game to be both catchy and charming. It was a major win for Sony and was one of Japan Studio's biggest hits to date. Parappa the Rapper is a game that still holds up in present day. With only about an hour-long story mode to play through, you'd be doing yourself no favors to skip out on it. I strongly believe that this title was a pivotal moment for gaming, and it definitely paved the way for some of the most legendary music-based games we've seen throughout history. But the team at Japan Studio were just getting started, and it was time for them to lend their expertise on another legendary IP that we'll come to discuss in this next segment. So put on your racing helmet and get ready to shift some gears, cause it's time for Gran Turismo. While the next game on our roster hadn't been released until 1997, the development for Gran Turismo goes back much further than you may have expected. Our story begins with Kazunori Yamauchi, a young Japanese game designer with ambitions of redefining the entire racing genre and taking simulation to a whole new level. He designed his first game by the name of Motortoon Grand Prix, and shortly after was made president of Palace Entertainment. With many PlayStation exclusive racers at that time having a more arcade-style approach to their mechanics and gameplay, Kazunori and his team were aiming to put their players behind the wheel of cars that don't just stop on a dime or bend to every corner. They wanted their game to be strategic and require more skill than the average racing game. While their first game, Motortoon Grand Prix, was released for the Japanese launch of the PS1 in 1994, Kazunori had been working on the concept of Gran Turismo since '92. The development cycle of the game was fairly unorganized in the beginning, with constant changes in production teams throughout the years, and as little as only 7 or so developers being on the project at one point. During the majority of the game's creation, a large amount of their team were tasked in the production of the Motortoon series, leaving Gran Turismo to be almost like a side project to the studio. But for Kazunori, it was much more than that. It was his masterpiece, and he intended on seeing it through, no matter the cost. He was once asked about the development process of Gran Turismo and how difficult it was to create. He answered by saying, "It took 5 years. In those 5 years, we could not see the end. I would wake up at work, go to sleep at work. It was getting cold, so I knew it must be winter. I estimate I was home only about 4 days a year. It was a grinding process with many hiccups in development, and with ambitions to use at least 75% of the PS1's hardware resources, it's safe to say that they ran into a few issues along the way. But after being recruited by Japan studio Shuei Yoshida in search of ideas for new games to develop for the PS1, Kazunori had decided to use their resources to his advantage and pitched the games in hopes of having a much larger team working behind his dream title. Unfortunately though, Sony wanted no parts of it, as they were much more concerned on the development of the Motortoon series, as the first game was selling well and a sequel was already in the works. Kazunori knew that he was going to have to please Sony in order to get them on board with the idea of funding Gran Turismo, and so he continued with the development of Motortoon's sequel, all the while using what little time he had left to work on his passion project. And after a successful release of the second Motortoon game, Kazunori once again pitched his idea Gran Turismo to Sony, and this time, they gave it the green light to go ahead. This is when Japan Studio stepped in to join Kazunori and his team in the development process, and when the vision of Gran Turismo was finally coming to life. Taking 5 years in total to complete, with a budget of $5 million, Gran Turismo was finally released on December 23, 1997. The game was a massive commercial hit, selling over 1 million copies in its first month in Japan, and became the best-selling game of 1998 in the United States. It was widely praised for its massive roster of licensed vehicles, so much so that it was even awarded with multiple Game of the Year awards, and was regarded as the greatest racing game of all time. For anyone who was there at the time when Gran Turismo first hit the scene, you know what I mean when I say this was one of those games that truly shifted the industry. Much like GTA had paved the path for open world games later on down the line, Gran Turismo was the pioneer in simulation racing, and introduced players to adrenaline-soaked gameplay in a way that had never been thought to be possible up to this point. And while we have to hand the majority of credit to Kazunori and his relentless team of developers for their independent work on Gran Turismo, this game was only another example of the greatness in which Japan Studio had a hand in developing. But as we'll soon come to find in their next game on the list, this studio was even more capable of creating greatness, all on their own. So it's time to switch out our racing helmets and get down to a little bit of monkey business in the bananas world of Ape Escape on the PlayStation 1. On June 22, 1999, the world of platforming games had welcomed its newest edition, a title that was not only one of the most beloved exclusives of all time for the PlayStation 1, but was also pivotal in introducing the use of the DualShock 1 controller. Ape Escape, a classic platformer developed by the wonderful team at Japan Studios, is a game that I'm sure many of you 90s babies are likely to share fond memories of. The game's story is about as wonky as you would expect, beginning with a monkey by the name of Spectre, who acquires a helmet that raises his intelligence to new heights, making him capable of escaping the zoo and mass-producing these helmets with intent on building an army of other apes under his control. Spectre and his lackeys end up busting down the front door of a professor's lab and make use of his time machine with intentions of changing history for the worse. We then meet our main protagonist Spike and his buddy Jake, on their way to the professor's lab in hopes of using the time machine for themselves. But when they arrive, they come to find the lab is being overrun by monkeys, and Spectre ends up transporting all of them back in time together. Spike is separated from his friend in the process, but is luckily able to make contact with the professor, who instructs him to capture all the apes and prevent them from making any serious changes to the past. Spectre then contacts the professor with news of his plan to make apes the superior race for the future, in which humans will be subservient to them. And with news of this, it's now up to Spike to fool the plan of Spectre and ensure that history can return back to normal. It's an odd tale, but it works well with the game's atmosphere nonetheless. The gameplay was incredibly unique for its time, especially in its use of the DualShock controller. Ape Escape was very well known for its unique control schemes. For example, the left stick was your typical character movement, while the right stick was used to maneuver whatever items you had equipped. Strangely enough, the R1 and L1 buttons were used to jump, while the shape buttons being used to cycle through your inventory. It was a far cry from the typical gameplay format found at this time, but worked well for what the game was aiming to accomplish. I remember personally playing this game back in the day, and man was it a blast. You'll find yourself traversing through 20 different levels, collecting monkeys, discovering new gadgets, and unlocking minigames. And while the game's design may sound simple enough, it can most definitely present a challenge for even the most seasoned of gamers. Each level is designed with charming aesthetics in mind, and offers plenty of incentive for exploration. With up to 204 different monkeys to capture, you're gonna have to use your wits to track all of them down, as they won't always be hiding in plain sight, which presents just enough challenge for gamers of all experience levels. Ape Escape is a testament to the unique nature of Japan's studio, as well as their willingness to think outside the box. It's a classic for many a gamer such as myself, and is one that PlayStation lovers all over the world have grown to appreciate even more with time. It was a bold step in the right direction for the studio, now having their work appreciated in multiple releases of the 90s. But with Square Enix and their knockout franchise of Final Fantasy making big waves in the industry, Sony knew it was their turn to capitalize on this trend and recruit Japan's studio for their next big project. So for the next game on our list, we're going to travel to the fictional world of indiness, as we uncover a game that shaped the lives of many RPG fans of the late 90s. So ready your dragons, and get prepared for some good old-fashioned CGI cutscenes as we dive into the wonderful world of the Legend of Dragoon. The 90s were a pivotal era for gaming, with many IPs making their mark in the 5th generation's most iconic offerings. You had the debut of the Fallout series in 1997, for example, as well as the legendary JRPG Xenogears being released in 1998. These were IPs that made their debut within a genre that was heavily competitive at this time, with many RPG fans focusing their attention to the many successful offerings of the Final Fantasy series. Final Fantasy has always been a widely successful series for longer than some of us have even been alive, but the peak of its success was found to be in 1997, with the record-breaking release of Final Fantasy VII on the PS1. FF7 had sold over 2 million units within its first 3 days of release, with some critics claiming it to be quite possibly the greatest game ever made. And as we've seen with Sony and really any business that wants to make money, they took notice of Squaresoft's success with the Final Fantasy series and decided it was time for them to get their hands into the realm of RPGs as well. And while the next game on our list of discussion had only began development a year before the release of FF7, for me personally, I think it was pretty clear how much the Final Fantasy series had an influence on it. But that's not to say that this game didn't have plenty of unique features of its own. The Legend of Dragoon, released on December 2nd, 1999 in Japan and June 13th of 2000 in North America, was a JRPG created by Japan Studio and was one of the team's largest projects to develop up to this point. Directed and designed by Yasuki Hasabi, along with producer Shuhei Yoshida, they wanted to create a world that was both mesmerizing and fresh for fans of the JRPG genre. It recruited art director Kenichi Iwata to create designs of the characters, giving them their iconic looks which complemented the captivating atmosphere that the game provides. The game's development began in 1996, with most of Japan's studio working on other games such as the previously mentioned Ape Escape, leading to the team of developers organized to work on Dragoon to be quite small. But over time, emphasis on the game's development began to grow, which brought in even more developers to work on the game, as well as the budget growing to a whopping 16 million, which at that time was nothing to shake a stick at. While the game made use of flashy CGI cutscenes throughout its story mode, this was a concept that almost didn't make its way into the final version, as they were afraid the transition from real-time gameplay to CGI cutscenes would be too jarring for its players to appreciate. But luckily they opted for its use, as the visual work of the cutscenes in this game are nothing short of stunning. And while there was plenty of beauty to appreciate within the look of Dragoon, where this title really shined for its players was in its narrative and gameplay. The story follows Dart, a man with a chip on his shoulder who's returning home after a 5-year journey of searching for the monster who had destroyed his village and family as a child. While en route, Dart is attacked by a mysterious dragon. Upon narrowly escaping the clutches of this merciless dragon and making his way back to his hometown of Sales, he comes to find that his home has been destroyed and his childhood friend Shanna has been taken as a prisoner. The captors and those responsible for this destruction are the Imperial Sandora army, who are actively trying to stake their claim all over the region of Sertio. Upon Dart arriving on the scene of this destruction, he decides it's time for him to save his friend Shanna, and long story short, this leads to him receiving the power of a Dragoon. Dragoons are essentially knights chosen by fate to rule over dragons, and are given the ability of transformation with these powers. Upon this newfound gift being inherited by Dart, the rest of the game's story begins to unwind, with many twists and turns throughout. The game was ambitious in its nature, and featured an innovative use of QuickTime events or additions within its combat system. While most RPGs of this era were strictly turn-based, Legend of Dragoon used QuickTime events to spice up the combat mechanics, and give its players an even more engaging experience. The environments are composed of beautifully designed pre-rendered backgrounds with 3D polygonal characters, a visual style that die-hard fans of the late 90s JRPG aesthetic are sure to love. The game featured 4 discs that would have to be swapped out as you progress throughout the story, due to the large size of the CGI cutscenes. And that wasn't the only thing that was large.
Pause.
As the main story is reported to keep its players busy for an average of around 47 hours or more, with completionists reporting almost 70 hours of gameplay. But having released just a couple of years after one of the most successful JRPGs of all time, how did Dragoon fare among its critics? Well, the consensus was a bit mixed. Following the game's release, it seemed that reviewers either completely loved the game or just had a list of complaints, and a lot of people who enjoy the game have speculated that it was given mixed reception due to its out-of-the-box style of gameplay, as the addition system within combat was something that had never been seen before in an RPG. But that's not to say there weren't plenty of critics who enjoyed the game just as much as the massive cult following it would soon acquire. Many critics praised the game for its beautiful cinematography and impressive length, with the majority of complaints only lying in the frequency of random encounters. And while the reception was mixed, it didn't stop the public from wanting to get their hands on the hottest new PlayStation exclusive, and ended up selling over 160,000 units in its first week of release. As for the West, the response was even greater, with the United States release having much stronger sales. Overall, The Legend of Dragoon was an ambitious project for the team at Japan Studio, and after years of hard work and juggling the development of other games, this game came to be a cult classic for JRPG fans all over the world, and is still beloved in present day. Many of its fans have been begging for a remake for some time now, but as for it ever happening, we'll just have to wait and see. But if there's one game that was done just right the first time around, it's definitely the next one on our list. So prepare to move into the 6th generation of gaming, as we dive into one of Japan Studio's most impactful releases of all time, with Ico on the PlayStation 2. Now this is a game that I'm very excited to be talking about, as it was one of the very first games I had ever experienced for the PlayStation 2. Ico was developed by the team Ico, a division of Japan Studio, and is a game that throws its players into a world of both mystery and pure wonder. The game follows Ico, a young boy who is considered to be cursed by his village due to the horns he has growing on his head. The warriors of the village in which he resides have taken him to a mysterious castle and locked him inside of a coffin-like prison to be sacrificed and never seen again. A tremor within the fortress causes the coffin to topple and allows Ico to quickly escape. Searching for an exit, he runs across a young ghostly-looking girl who is being held captive in a small cage. Ico helps her to escape and soon discovers that there's something strange about this girl, as a shadow-like creature soon appears, trying to reclaim the girl and return her back to captivity. While the girl is left in a weakened state and is unable to do simple tasks such as jump and climb, that leaves for you to do the platforming and lead her along the way throughout your dangerous escape from this shrouded fortress. In return, the girl is able to manipulate certain puzzles within the castle and clear areas that would otherwise have no way around them. It's an interesting dynamic that these two characters share with one another, and makes the gameplay that much more immersive. The atmosphere in Ico is incredible, and does an amazing job at making the player feel the gravity and loneliness of the situation at hand. Not to mention the sound design is completely immaculate, Howling winds, echoes, and ambient soundscapes will further immerse you into the game's world, and with a focus on simple gameplay, you'll have no problem diving headfirst into the game's beautifully crafted story. The original concept for Ico had began in 1997, with lead designer Fumito Ueda coming up with the concept for a Boy Meets World story, in which two characters would hold hands throughout their journey, forming a bond without the use of communication. He took this concept and began working with producer Kenji Kaido in 1998 with hopes of developing the game for the original PlayStation. He knew that he wanted the game to be different from anything ever seen before, coupled with a consistent aesthetic and to design a world that was imaginary yet realistic. They decided the game would be minimalistic, meaning there would be a lack of interface, only a single enemy, and the primary focus of escaping the castle, in hopes of keeping the player immersed rather than overwhelmed. Ueda decided he was going to need more hands on deck, recruiting multiple programmers, artists, and designers on board to fulfill the project, and this very team of discussion ended up becoming one of the most beloved divisions of Japan's studio, Team Ico. Unfortunately, soon after, the team will meet a crossroads, coming to find that the limited resources of the PlayStation OG would be incapable of sustaining the vision they had at hand, so they found themselves with a choice to either pitch the project entirely or to move on to more advanced hardware with the PlayStation 2. As you may have already guessed, they chose the latter, and Ico was in full swing to be released for the next-gen console. Releasing on September 25, 2001, Ico was met with incredible reception, with almost perfect scores across the board, with many critics stating it to be a work of art, boasting simple yet rewarding gameplay. But despite the widespread critical acclaim, Ico surprisingly never sold well. By 2009, 8 years after the game's initial release, Ico had only sold around 700,000 copies worldwide, with only 270,000 of those being in North America. Ueda had speculated that was because of the underwhelming appearance of the North American version's cover art, as well as the minimalistic design of the game, hurting more than helping when it came to people viewing promotional screenshots of the game. And as someone who had seen this title many different times at EB Games as a kid, I gotta agree with them. The only reason I had ever played it to begin with was because my mom picked it out for me at Blockbuster one day. Safe to say, I was unhappy with this choice at first, but I still decided to give it a play when I got home. And much to my surprise, I loved it. The lead designer at Team Ico had such an outlandish and strange concept in mind for the game, so I can absolutely see how it would be overlooked at that time, competing with other 2001 releases such as Metal Gear Solid 2, Final Fantasy X, or Silent Hill 2, I mean, the list goes on. It would be hard to see games like those on your store shelf and then just be like, yeah, this is the one I want. But for those gamers who have given Ico a chance, really know what I mean when I say this game is a must-play for people of all ages, taste, and experience. It's once again a testament to how incredibly unique the team at Japan Studios are with their games, and was the inception of one of the most influential development divisions for PlayStation as a whole. This is a game I've wanted to talk about for years, and I'm glad to finally be able to do so in this video. So if you're one of those people who decided to sleep on this gem back in the day, now's your time to change that, because I promise you won't be disappointed. In the realms of survival horror and its most legendary of IPs, Silent Hill is one that comes to mind when discussing some of the all-time greats. Released in 1999 for the Sony PlayStation, Silent Hill was one of the most immersive and unique games of its time, giving players an experience that was equally unsettling as it was captivating. And as much as I love a good old discussion on anything Silent Hill, we're actually here to discuss the game's writer and director, Keishiro Toyama, and how he came to be responsible for creating the next game on our list. Mr. Toyama began his work in 1994 as a graphic designer for Konami. After doing work on multiple projects for the company, he ended up being assigned to work on Silent Hill, in which he wrote, directed, and did the background design for the game. Shortly after the game's critical success, he ended up resigning from his position at Team Silent, only to join on at Japan Studio and create his own division by the name of Project Siren. He was ready to get to work on his next game, and with a slew of talented individuals being assigned to his roster, he had high expectations for him and his team to create something unique for the next-gen console. His next big work of art came into the form of Forbidden Siren, a PlayStation exclusive that was released on November 6, 2003 in Japan and April 20, 2004 for North America. The game takes place in the fictional Japanese village by the name of Hanuda, which was heavily influenced by a real-life abandoned village in Shishibu, Saitama. In the game, the village of Hanuda has fallen victim to the events of a supernatural disaster. From what began as an earthquake has turned into something much more bizarre. All water sources and rain in the village have turned blood red, and the majority of its inhabitants have been infected with some kind of unknown affliction, causing them to bleed from their eyes and act in a violent manner. The game's narrative is told through the perspective of 10 total survivors, all of which are in search of answers on how to overcome this increasingly terrifying situation. Each chapter of the game is told from the perspective of a different survivor and makes use of an interesting mechanic called sightjacking. With your characters being highly vulnerable to enemy attacks as in most survival horror games, the mechanic of sightjacking allows you to see through the eyes of your enemy in order to carefully plan your route throughout each level or to coordinate traps and surprise attacks. This was an incredibly unique concept for its genre and made its gameplay that much more strategic. Another interesting concept within the game is in its use of a butterfly effect system, meaning your actions with one character can affect the story progress of others, depending on your actions throughout each mission. Throughout the story, you'll uncover the origins behind these events, and come to find that there's something much darker going on with this village than anyone may have expected. And with serious attention to detail in the game's level and sound design, Siren does an incredible job of immersing you in this haunting tale of Japanese folklore. While the reception of the game was mixed upon its release, it's a title that ended up creating a cult following for good reason. It was an ambitious step in a new direction of survival horror, and while it wasn't so easy to get everyone on board with the game's mechanics or unforgiving difficulty, it was Japan Studios' first big step into the world of a beloved genre. It's a game that's sure to satisfy any horror fan patient enough to overcome its sometimes daunting challenges, and is well worth a playthrough for any of those looking to spice up the retro gaming body count. The game also spawned 2 more sequels following its release, with the third entry being produced with a much more Western influence. So whether you're in need of a game that thinks outside the box or just looking to spend a rainy day playing a cult classic, Siren is sure to satiate all those spooky cravings and give its players an experience worth talking about for generations to come. In this list, we've covered the likes of some of Japan Studios' greatest offerings in gaming, as well as discussed their ambitious nature with a focus on creating games with original concepts and immersive worlds. And while a lot of these games have been incredible experiences to play through for me personally, there's one certain game that will forever hold a special place in my heart. Coming from the talented division of Team Ico and following in the footsteps of their debut title, comes the minimalistic action-adventure that is Shadow of the Colossus. This is a game that left a lasting impression on me, and one that spawned many fond memories within my very first playthrough of it. It's one of those games that is not only captivating in its visual, story, and combat, but also contains a narrative that is both thought-provoking and somewhat haunting. Shadow of the Colossus is by far one of Japan Studios' most highly revered offerings, as it was critically acclaimed and received several different Game of the Year awards. And much like Ico, Shadow of the Colossus was designed for pure immersion, using minimalistic gameplay and purely focusing on the task at hand. The game follows our main protagonist by the name of Wonder, who is on a mission to revive a mysterious girl by the name of Mono. Wander has entered a desolate region called the Forbidden Land, in search of the power needed to bring Mono back to life. He reaches an area in this region called the Shrine of Worship, and is met with a mysterious voice that seems to be coming from the temple. The voice is of an entity by the name of Dorman. This entity is surprised to see Wander and the ancient sword that he possesses. Wander explains to the voice his reasoning for coming to this forbidden land, in which the voice replies with a solution to his problem. He tells Wander that he will grant his wish, but only in the case that he completes a rite that's needed to destroy the 16 idols found within the temple hall. If he's to complete this task, then Mono will be brought back to life, but at a deadly cost. You see, in order to destroy these idols, he has to seek out the 16 different colossal beasts that are spread throughout the land, and slay them one by one. And each time he kills one of these massive creatures, a part of Dorman's essence is released into Wander's body, causing him to deteriorate over time, in which he will eventually die if his mission is completed. But to Wander, this is a sacrifice he is more than willing to make, and so begins our journey. It's a solid but pretty straightforward concept, and the game really wastes no time in throwing you straight into the action, as you get right to work in hunting down each colossi. The game's landscapes are vast yet minimal. It's almost like you're in a dreamscape with how beautiful yet lonely the environments of this game are. And in the case of this game, less really is more when it comes to the atmosphere. With a title like this being spread so thin in terms of dialogue and other characters, you really feel the weight of loneliness in Wander's mission, as all you've got is yourself and your trusty steed by the name of Agro. You'll spend the majority of your journey with Agro, as he's your golden ticket to traversing these vast landscapes in your search for the 16 Colossi. Upon finding each monster, you'll be tasked with tracking down their weak points, scaling the massive body of these beasts, and then stabbing them multiple times in their weak points to ultimately finish the fight. This ambitious concept for combat in a game was extremely unique for its time, really requiring a sense of strategy and overall patience to take down each foe. And with most action games just consisting of button mashing and repetition, this type of combat was an incredibly refreshing experience, and really delivered some intense moments to get your adrenaline pumping. Each fight was more challenging than the last, and gave it a very gratifying experience to scale and destroy these many diverse creatures. And while I don't want to spoil too much, keep in mind there's a reason behind the different appearance and abilities for each of the 16 Colossi, as symbolism plays a huge part in both this game's story and overall meaning. Once again, Shadow of the Colossus is a testament to how incredible a game can be when you aren't afraid to take a couple of chances, and do things a little different than usual, and that's fitting for a studio who's made it a point to do so in almost all of their games. Team Ico had really outdone themselves in their second release, and for a game that came out almost 20 years ago to hold up so well in present day, I can confidently say it's one of the greatest games of all time. So for the few unlucky souls who have yet to give this game a shot, the time is now. Whether you play the PS4 remaster or the original PS2 version, you won't be disappointed. But just remember to keep an open mind and be ready to hold on for dear life, because things can get a little bumpy on this beautiful journey. May 2nd of 2014, a rumored title by the codename of Project Beast was announced to the gaming community, following with widespread speculation of what's next for the 8th generation of gaming. After screenshots being released shortly after the announcement of this mysterious title, people began to discuss the origins of the game and what was to come of it. The legendary studio at From Software had their logo planted on one of the screenshots, forcing fans to believe it would be a new Souls-like game that they were working on. And with the community abuzz for more details on this project and what it was all about, E3 2014 had allowed for all this speculation to come to an end, as the game's true identity was finally going to be revealed. This title came to be revealed as Bloodborne, a PS4 exclusive created by Hidetaka Miyazaki. Miyazaki is the man responsible for many legendary IPs such as Demon's Souls, Armored Core, Sekiro, and Elden Ring. And with Demon's Souls being a game that was highly revered and mounting anticipation for even more Souls-like action, it's safe to say the response to this news was huge. And while Hidetaka obviously played a primary role in making Bloodborne come to fruition, what many don't know is how much of a hand that the team of Japan Studio had in this game's inception. Japan Studio were actually the ones who approached Miyazaki with the idea of creating a next-gen Souls-like title, and were willing to give him the rights in making his next game a PS4 exclusive. Sony needed the next big thing in Soul-style games to be exclusive to their upcoming console, and they knew Miyazaki was the man for the job in terms of making the game come to life. So working alongside one another, they created one of the most beloved Souls-like games of all time, combining elements of both survival horror and your typical high challenge of a Soul-style game. Bloodborne is a title that really is unlike anything you've ever seen before. Steeped in gothic architecture and grotesque creatures, the game is a visual nightmare, but it's one that you can't look away from. Dripping with incredible detail and danger at every corner, Bloodborne is a game that has an incredibly challenging experience from the very moment you begin your journey. The game takes place in Yharnam, a fictional city that is known for its medical advances and expertise. You create a character and begin your journey to this mysterious town, only to find it overrun by hellish monsters who have fallen victim to an unknown plague. And with our character now stuck in the middle of this horrific setting, it's up to your wits and combat ability to ensure you can escape this horrifying nightmare. The combat mechanics are similar to most other Souls-like games, with the use of a lock-on system and evasive maneuvers being crucial for winning fights. The enemies themselves present a serious challenge, and will require plenty of trial and error to either defeat or evade while advancing through each of the 23 chapters. The game's visual aesthetic is heavily inspired by the literary works of H.P. Lovecraft, with surreal-looking enemies and an unsettling atmosphere that really paints a sense of dread in the game. Bloodborne was met with an incredible response, leading many of its critics to give it near-perfect ratings. And while the game wasn't directly developed by the talented individuals at Japan Studio, I still thought it was important to include the game, as they were definitely responsible for giving Miyazaki the backing needed to make this game happen. It's my personal favorite game developed by From Software, and a game that was incredibly unique in the beloved genre of Souls-like titles. Much like most of the games on this list, it's well worth a playthrough. But before we close out this list and begin to wind down our journey throughout the wonderful look inside Japan Studios' universe, I'd like to take some time and discuss a final entry that has come to be one of my favorite games on the PlayStation 4. It was also the very last game ever developed by the talented people over at Team Ico. So put on your thinking caps and get ready for some puzzle-solving adventures in The Last Guardian on the PlayStation 4. As we had previously discussed, Team Ico and their roster of minimalistic titles have found a niche that was working very well for them in the development of their games. Presenting their players with simple yet rewarding gameplay, a focus on narrative, and deeply impressive visuals made these games instant classics and had fans all over the world in awe at what was next to come from the team. Going back to 2007, Fumito Ueda, the director of both Ico and Shadow of the Colossus, was already hard at work on creating the next big thing on their roster. In Shadow of the Colossus, Ueda had stated that he intended on creating a much more emotional connection for Wander and Mono, as well as the Colossi he's tasked in slaying, but was shocked to find that the majority of their players felt the strongest connection in-game with Wander's horse, Agro. This connection between man and beast came to be an inspiration in the writing of his next game, as well as including a companionship-based system much like Ico had. It was almost as if he was looking to fuse both Ico and Shadow of the Colossus into one, picking the strongest points of each in order to form the ultimate game. He found that people were often drawn to lifelike creatures in video games, and wanted to create an animal that behaved in a realistic fashion. These ideas came to form Trico, a griffin-like beast with a mysterious origin. Ueda had based the behaviors of Trico to that of a domesticated dog, with our main character having to earn its trust in the beginning of the game. But once that trust had been gained, Trico is there to protect you with its life and will become dependent on your company over time. And so it was a promising concept which sounded right up the alley of any fans of the previous works of Team Ico, but that's not to say it didn't come with a few hiccups along the way. The development on The Last Guardian was going very slow, with the division at Team Ico having a much smaller team than most working development studios at that time. Ueda was aiming to achieve something big, calling the title Project Trico, and teasing it for the very first time in 2008, with the planned release for the PlayStation 3. Unfortunately, the game wasn't running too well on the system's hardware, with many of its early trailers having to be souped up in order to look presentable. And with Team Ico struggling to meet the vision that Ueda had in place, it further delayed the game's release, and things were looking a bit uncertain. With Sony making the decision to move development of Project Trico onto the PlayStation 4, it gave Ueda more resources to ensure his vision would reach its full potential. But in 2011, things took a bit of a turn, with Ueda leaving Sony and disbanding Team Ico to create his own studio by the name of Gen Design. He was contractually obligated to continue work on Project Trico, and with the majority of Team Ico joining him in the switch to Gen Design, things were looking up for the game's development. And with the power of the PlayStation 4 on their side, it was hard to imagine that Project Trico was going to be anything less than incredible. Formally reintroducing the game at E3 2015, as well as revealing its true title, the hype was on, and following its official release on December 6, 2016, it's clear to see why so many fans of Team Ico were so excited to see this one. The narrative of The Last Guardian follows a protagonist known by nothing more than the Boy, who mysteriously awakens in a withering castle known as the Nest. He discovers Trico, who has been wounded and chained to the floor. Trico is very hostile at the Boy upon first sight, but after removing a couple of spears from his wounds and feeding him his favorite snack of wooden barrels, Trico begins to warm up to the Boy, which allows us to free him from the chains and begins our journey through the castle ruins. As we seek to find an escape as well as the origin behind Trico, much like Team Ico's former titles, the execution of The Last Guardian is nothing short of captivating. Much like the relationship between Ico and Yorda, Trico and the Boy will spend the entire game together, but their dynamic in the gameplay is much more balanced. Trico will act as your defender, and will also aid you in reaching certain areas, but it's up to the Boy to protect this beast in certain situations as well, to ensure that he's kept fed, and much like a dog, Trico is very dependent on your presence. The behavior of Trico makes the game incredibly immersive, as he really does act just as though a typical domesticated animal would. But when it comes to getting on his bad side, you better watch out. Early on in the game, we discover a mirror-like shield which summons an electrifying reaction in Trico whenever he's faced with its reflections. This ability will be used to clear certain areas, and it's definitely encouraged to let Trico know whenever he's done a good job. The Last Guardian was also first of Team Ico's games that included in-game narration, which is used to build a connection with the boys' inner thoughts, as well as gaining tips for progressing throughout the game. It really is a wonderful fusion of the earlier works of Team Ico, and is a game that really surprised me with its charm. Upon the game's long-awaited release, it was met with some surprisingly mixed emotions. While most critics had praised the game for its beautiful representation and engaging story, the biggest complaint came in the direction of Trico and his sometimes stubborn attitude. As we had discussed before, Ueda wanted Trico to be as realistic as possible, and if there's anything we know about our pets, they can be quite defiant at times. This level of realism will sometimes show in Trico, as he will need to be coerced into certain actions within the game, even if they are key moments in progressing. Some people admired this level of depth for the immersion factor, but some just found it to take them out of the game and frustrate them. I personally had never had too much of a problem with the behavior of Trico, as I was actually incredibly fond of his role in the game, but even with these complaints being fairly common, the game still fared well, and was met with overall exceptional ratings. However you may look at it, whether this game was the death of one of the most beloved studio divisions in gaming, or was a product of growth for one of the greatest gaming directors the PlayStation has ever seen, it's a mixed bag of emotions. But one thing's for sure is that The Last Guardian is a game that I will forever cherish, and is one that I'll be sure to revisit again in the future. Throughout the wonderful history of Japan studios and their incredible roster of games, this one definitely stands in my top 3, and is a journey that shouldn't be missed by any fans of action-adventure. But much like the unfortunate demise of Team Ico, there were much bigger problems for Japan Studio on the way, and just as all good things must end, so did this beloved company. Giving a brief summary on the demise of Japan Studio, it all basically came down to one thing: money. Sony had been carefully watching Japan studios from as early as 2008, around the time that The Last Guardian was having issues in development. They felt that the studio was inhibiting the growth of the company, and with the routine of creating games that were unique and sometimes outlandish, they felt that the studio was no longer a safe bet in being a profitable resource. Sony slowly began dwindling down on the budget for Japan Studio to work with, causing most of its employees to leave over time, and with Sony refusing to renew many of its contracts within its multiple divisions, they were essentially leaving the studio out to dry, and basically forced the developers of Japan Studio to either migrate to Team Asobi, a division that primarily focuses on the development of the Astrobot games, or they had to look elsewhere for work. So because of the unique potential of Japan Studio and their many talented divisions being too much of a risk on the pockets of Sony, they decided it was time to squeeze them out for good, and the studio officially closed on April 1st, 2021. And no, sadly, it wasn't an April Fool's joke. But despite this unfortunate news, I think it's safe to say that Japan studios have left a lasting legacy on the world of gaming that is sure to live on for many generations to come. It's created some of the most unique and captivating titles the world has ever seen, and has often done it in a way that was friendly to gamers of all walks of life. Japan studios aim to immerse its players and push the envelope in terms of presentation, taught us the importance of friendship as well as believing in yourself, and gave us multiple decades of virtual escape throughout their captivating worlds. It's nothing short of incredible what they were able to do for the gaming industry, and I hope this video did some justice in highlighting their beautiful journey. But just as the legacy of Japan studios had to come to an end, so must this video, and I thank you all so much for joining me along for the ride. Please comment down below what some of your favorite games from this studio were, and maybe even some of your favorite memories of them. I'd love to hear. But until next time, my name is Vincent. Take care of yourselves, and I hope to see you all in the next one. Peace out, guys.